Welcome to the first public lecture of the academic year, entitled Trinity, Klaus Fuchs, Oxford, and the Making of the Atomic Bomb, a story of physics and of espionage. I hope you and your loved ones are all safe and well at this most challenging of times. My name is Shipsey. I'm a professor of physics and head of the Oxford Physics Department. I'll say a few words about us and then introduce the speaker today. This is a Zoom webinar, so please enter your questions into the Q&A window. We will read out the questions at the end of the lecture, and Professor Frank Close will answer them. There will be ample time for questions. As there are many alumni in the audience today, I'll say a few words about Oxford physics and how we're getting on at this time. So I want you all to know that we're doing very well. Our students are in Oxford and they're receiving a mix of online and face-to-face teaching, the latter mostly in the laboratories and in the tutorials. Our research continues apace. Experimentalists and engineers and technical support are working in the labs as we speak and in the workshops as well. And everyone else is working from home. Papers are being written, grants are being submitted and awarded. Theses have been successfully defended. Meetings and conferences are occurring online. We're winning plenty of awards and prizes for our work. And we care and look out for every member of the Oxford physics family. And we're fortified by our knowledge that our mission and that of the university has never been more important to the world. As many of you know, Oxford physics seeks to bring the transformative power of physics to the foremost scientific problems of our time, from the smallest scales of particle physics to the largest scales of the universe as a whole, and everything in between, unraveling complexity to discover the way the universe works. Discoveries in physics, as you know, have formed the foundation of countless technological advances and play a crucial role in many scientific areas. Many techniques used in fields as disparate as medical imaging to quantum computing are derived from physics instrumentation, and even the World Wide Web, invented by our former student, Tim Berners-Lee, and our colleague, grew out of information processing and communications requirements for particle physics. We work with enterprise and industry to bring our Oxford discoveries to society. We educate the next generation of leaders in physics and engage with the public and with the government to educate them on the enabling power of physics. The contributions of physics to solving global problems, such as energy production, environmental protection, global warming, and public health, are essential and have an enormous impact on our world. As head of the department, I have the privilege of working alongside truly remarkable colleagues, other professors, students, technicians, and engineers, and administrative support staff. They include world leaders in particle physics, astrophysics, space instrumentation, quantum computing, quantum materials, climate physics, plasma physics, including nuclear fusion, solar cell physics, and accelerator physics. And in biophysics, the last of these, and the last couple of weeks, you'd have seen a raft of stories on the web and on the television and the newspapers about the ultra-fast COVID-19 diagnostic tests that we have developed in the physics department, working directly on throat swabs from COVID-19 without the need for genome extraction, purification, or amplification of the viruses. The method starts with the rapid labeling of virus particles in the sample with short fluorescent DNA strands. A microscope is then used to collect and image the samples, and with each image containing hundreds of fluorescently labeled viruses, machine learning software quickly and automatically identifies the virus present in the sample. And this approach exploits the fact that distinct virus types have different fluorescence labeling due to differences in their surface chemistry, size, and shape. And finally, I should have seen in the news a couple of weeks ago, our esteemed colleague, Richard Penrose, had just been awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics for the discovery that black hole formation is a robust prediction of general relativity. There's so much more I could tell you about the ambitious programs we have to harness the power of the second quantum revolution, about students and faculty creating startups at an accelerating rate, 5 this year alone, our wonderful new course on enterprise and innovation, and our outreach program that has reached 200,000 people in the last 5 years. But time is short. If you'd like to learn more, please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. So now it gives me great pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Frank Close, our esteemed Emeritus Professor of Theoretical Physics. His research career was focused on understanding the way that quarks and gluons form strongly interacting particles, the atomic nucleus, and exotic combinations, such as gluons. He gained his doctorate in particle physics at Oxford during the days when Rudolf Peierls, the focus of today's talk, was the head of the department. And he joined the Rutherford Laboratory, where he became the head of theoretical physics in 1990. In 2000, the UK funding agency for particle physics closed the theory group at the Rutherford Laboratory, which was good news for Oxford and for Exeter College, as Frank then arrived there on the first day of the new millennium, the 1st of January 2001. He is well known for his popularization of science. He won the Royal Society's Michael Faraday Prize for Science Communication in 2013. He is the only professional scientist to have won 3 British Science Writer Prizes for articles in the mainstream media, and he gave the esteemed Royal Institution Christmas lectures in 1993. He is the author of many truly wonderful books going back to the Cosmic Onion. He said he knew he was growing old when a newly appointed Oxford professor admitted to have been inspired by the Cosmic Onion as a teenager. And he's currently researching a biography of the Higgs boson, due out in 2022. Today's talk is a result of his newly published paperback, Trinity, available at all good bookstores if you can find one open. So without any further delay, it's a great honor and privilege to introduce to you Frank Close. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you very much, Ian. Well, hoping that everybody can hear me out there. Trinity, I chose the title for 2 reasons. One, of course, it was the code name that signaled the test of the atomic bomb back in 1945. There's also another aspect of Trinity, which is like Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And the father of the atomic bomb, Rudolf Peierls, I say father in the sense that it was in 1940 when he and Frisch first realized the possibility of making an atomic bomb, which started the whole of what eventually became the Manhattan Project. So he was like the father. Klaus Fuchs, who lived with the Peierls family, betraying not just the people who were making the bomb, but the Peierls family personally, was almost like a son to their family. So there's the father and the son. I'm not sure there's a Holy Ghost in this, but there's the spooks of MI5 and the FBI, who are the third strand in the espionage side of this story. And that is going to form one of the main themes of the talk. So to give a sense of the timescales, Peierls and Fuchs got together in 1941 at a time when Peierls was at the University of Birmingham. For 2 years, they worked on the theory of diffusion, the way to enrich uranium in gaseous form to improve the content of the rare form, uranium-235, which is the explosive form, as we will see later on. Experiments in that went on at Oxford during this period, but that's not going to form much of the theme of today's talk. In 1944, the whole mission moved across to North America, and Fuchs went across with Peierls, initially in New York for a year, where they were designing what became essentially Oak Ridge National Lab, and then to Los Alamos itself, where the bomb was designed, tested, and eventually delivered for the 2 years of 44 to 46. And through the whole of this period, as we will see, Fuchs was passing information about the bomb to the Russians. Then post-war, Peierls returned to Birmingham University and Fuchs stayed on for a year at Los Alamos, as we will see, effectively spying for the Brits, and then returned to Britain to work at Harwell, the new research laboratory just south of Oxford. And as I'll argue, in my opinion, although he had already spent that 5 years spying for Russia during the war, during a time when Russia were at least allies, post-war, for the next 4 years, he continued to pass information about the developing British atomic and nuclear programs for the Russians at a time when the Cold War was beginning, when Stalin had designs on Western Europe, and thanks to Fuchs, and almost alone at that stage due to Fuchs, Stalin had a full sense of the power of not just the Brits, but the American ability to withstand Russian work. So I think that during that period was Fuchs's most dangerous period, as we will see. So let's introduce the characters and tell the story. Rudolf Peierls and his wife Genia. Rudolf was born in 1907 in Germany. They were Jewish background and they fled Germany in the 30s because of Nazi persecution. Fuchs, by contrast, he was a Lutheran and a social democrat from a family that was strongly anti-Nazi. His mother, we now know, committed suicide by drinking hydrochloric acid. One of his sisters and his grandmother also committed suicide. And I think that this sort of background was there in his mind years later, as we will see, when finally he confessed to his espionage, a fact also we will see that nobody had been aware of throughout the whole period. So there was Fuchs in Germany, student. In 1933, the Nazis took over. The communists were the only people prepared to put candidates against them in the elections. And this attracted Fuchs to communism. He became a student activist. He was very soon on the Gestapo hit list. He was tipped off that the Gestapo were after him and he fled to France and then to Bristol, where he joined Bristol University as what we would now call a research student. And that is where he first met Peierls. And one of the things that I managed to find out was when it was that the pair of them first met. And in 1935, there was a conference took place at Bristol University. Peierls, who I've highlighted down at the bottom right, was one of the speakers. Fuchs, a new student, he'd only been there a matter of weeks at this stage, in the back. Circled in the front in green is Edward Teller. So there's the father of the hydrogen bomb in the States. So there's quite a few significant people at that stage, though of course at this stage nobody anticipated that. Whether Peierls met Fuchs at this stage is a separate question. Fuchs was certainly aware of Peierls. It was a year or so later when Peierls came and gave a seminar and learned of some work that Fuchs was doing and was very impressed by it. And that is how Peierls began to be aware of Fuchs, the scientist. Here's a picture of Fuchs in the departmental photograph the following year. So that is where we are in 1936. Fuchs was actually working on what we would now call microelectronics. Nothing at all to do with nuclear physics. Nuclear physics was a subject that even then was only really beginning. And it was in 1938 when the essential breakthrough that starts our story going took place, namely the discovery of the fission of uranium, and very quickly the discovery that you could have a chain reaction, that when neutrons hit uranium, they split it, and in the process of splitting, release also some spare neutrons, which can go on and make further hits and release further neutrons and so forth. And the possibility of an exponential increase in fissions, releasing energy, potentially explosively. Now, if that was the whole story, uranium in the rocks around us would be going off all the time, and it doesn't. And the reason is that the form of uranium which is most effective at doing this, uranium-235, is only about 7 atoms in every 1,000 of naturally occurring uranium, the result being that normal uranium is safe. So in 1938-39, as the war began, the received wisdom in the world of physics was that if you had tons of uranium, it may be possible to release energy from it gradually in the form of what we would now call a nuclear reactor. The idea that you might be able to make an explosion was really regarded as impossible at that stage. Surprisingly, it seems that nobody at that stage, at least, asked the question, but if I could somehow gather the rare form, enrich uranium so that it was pure U-235, how much would I need to make an explosion? We now know that that question was asked in the Soviet Union shortly after Peierls and Frisch here asked it in Birmingham. What was happening was that Frisch was doing some experiments, the purpose being to find out if he could, in practice, enrich uranium by diffusion. The idea being that the lighter U-235 would rise upwards relative to the heavier U-238, which would stay behind, pass it through a membrane. You've now got some enriched sample, which you then do it over and over again. The problem was Frisch realized he had no idea how much he was going to have to make. In fact, he was getting nowhere at all, it turned out. And he asked Peierls, how much do I need? And they didn't know. And Peierls did the calculation, and to both of their shock and horror, discovered that about the size of a grapefruit would be sufficient. If you could somehow make a grapefruit size of uranium-235, you had the potential to make an explosive. And the pair of them wrote a memorandum about this, which, to read it, is actually quite terrifying. They realized, remarkably, not just that this would make a huge explosion equivalent to about 1,000 tons of dynamite, but it would emit radiation, that the radiation would hang around and be potentially lethal, all things which we take for granted today. But this is 1940, this is completely new. And in their memorandum, they had a horrendous warning, which was that there is no means of defending, resisting the power of this weapon other than to have one yourself. So there in 1940, they had effectively foreseen what we today call mutually assured destruction. Now, they were both German emigres and immediately were terrified that this that they had just discovered might already be known to the Germans. I mean, any of you who've been involved in research know what it's like. You hit your head against the wall for a long time. Finally, you make the breakthrough and understand it. And it is suddenly so obvious, you wonder why you couldn't have seen it before. And the next panic is, have others already seen it? And that's exactly the situation that Peierls was in 1940. The possibility that Hitler and Nazis might already be developing this weapon was the thing that terrified them. And so they wrote this memorandum. It was sent to Whitehall, and the beginnings of what became known as the Tube Alloys Project to try and indeed enrich uranium with the potential eventually of getting enough to make a weapon. One of the many ironies in this story is that Frisch and Peierls, who were both German emigres, were not even allowed to take part in the meetings discussing the very idea that they had created because they had this German background, one of the many nonsenses that were happening at that time. Peierls, however, was soon put effectively the lead scientist in charge of this project, which involved several people around, several universities around the UK. As I said at the start, Oxford was very much driving some of the experimental work, designing membranes and doing the first experiments to see if you could, in practice, enrich uranium. The theoretical problems, however, were escalating exponentially, and by 1941, Peierls needed an assistant. And he heard that Fuchs, who he'd been very impressed with, who he'd met at Bristol some years before, Fuchs had been interned as an enemy alien and had just been released. He was now at Edinburgh University with Max Born, and Peierls, through Born, invited Fuchs to join him in Birmingham to take part as his assistant in this project. So that is April 1941. Now, this is a time when Russia and the Nazi Germany still had the non-aggression pact. That was not changed until June. It's only after June that Russia became an ally. So one of the questions behind all this is, when did Fuchs start passing information? Well, at this moment, Fuchs didn't know anything at all to pass. he knew no more than other nuclear physicists knew, the belief that you can't make a weapon. Only when he joins Peierls does he discover the first time the reality. Before he joins Peierls in May, we know that in April he took a trip from Edinburgh down to London, where he visited communist emigres in London at the Lawn Road flats in Hampstead. And during that meeting, he met a man, Colonel Kramer, who was the Soviet army attaché at the Soviet embassy. And Kramer knew about physics, and he talked to Fuchs about nuclear physics. Now, at this stage, as they say, don't panic, because Fuchs did not yet know anything about uranium-235 and the possibility of making a weapon. I think the most he could have told Kramer is that there are possibilities of generating energy. It's a very interesting area. And basically, the message was, let's keep in touch. We know that that meeting took place because I found in the National Archives, Fuchs overstayed. He was down there for several days. He overstayed, and he was only allowed a few days away from Edinburgh. He arrived at King's Cross Station in London to return to Edinburgh late, missed the train, had to report to the police station at King's Cross. And there it is, showing on the 15th of April 41, he was given permission to stay overnight at King's Cross and get the first train up to Edinburgh the next morning. So we know the meeting happened. We only know indirectly what took place. We do know that the following month, May, is when he then moved to Birmingham and started working with Peierls and lived with Rudy and Genia Peierls in their house, as I said, like a son. And this was something I hadn't realized how convenient, if you like, for the Peierls this was. Peierls' two children at that time had very recently moved away to Canada to stay with friends in Canada to keep them away from the bombing that was going on. So Rudy and Genia had suddenly found themselves in this empty nest, and Fuchs now arrives, a fellow anti-Nazi German in this empty house, and becomes a member of their family. And you can imagine the psychological good things that Fuchs brought to them at that time. We know that within weeks, if not a month or two, Fuchs was already passing information. And we know this for some reason I'll show you in a moment. But one of the things is that is the first irony in this tale, that here is Fuchs now joining Peierls to work on this top secret project. And so he has to be vetted. There are 25 files from MI5 on Fuchs in the National Archives. The very first entry in the first file, here labeled 1A, is a letter sent back in 1934 from Kiel in Germany to the consul in London about Fuchs, which says Fuchs joined the Communist Party because books of the Communist Party had been found in his apartment. So MI5 knew that Fuchs had communist affiliation. And this is a time where the Russians, the Soviet Union, is still in league with Nazi Germany. The great irony is that this letter, this information, originates with the Gestapo. And for that reason, the Brits decided to ignore it. They regarded anything coming from the Gestapo as suspect. As we now know, this is one of those rare occasions when you keep crying wolf, and this is the one occasion when the cry was right. But right through the whole period, every time Fuchs was vetted, this same thing came through. The only evidence they really had was this Gestapo letter. It was the Gestapo, they ignored it. When he first starts with Peierls here, when later the whole project moves to North America, after the war when he moves back to Harwell, when he goes to Los Alamos, at each stage, this Gestapo information is ignored. When did Fuchs make the decision? We don't know for sure, but I suspect it was probably in June. It was in June when the pact between the Nazis and the Russians broke down and the Soviet Union became allied to us. And Winston Churchill gave a talk on the old Home Service radio in which he said, the Russians are now our allies and we will give them every help we can. Now imagine yourself as Klaus Fuchs, that you, by total chance, have landed at the heart of this top secret project to design an atomic weapon, which has the possibility of changing the whole nature of warfare. This is a time when the British are very much under attack, and the Soviet Union are now our friends, and we are urged by the Prime Minister to give them every help we can. And you, strong communist, what do? Obviously, you take that as a call to arms. I don't think this is too much of an invention, because we do know that by August, he was already passing information. The weak link in the Russian espionage, as we will see, was all information had to work its way back to Moscow. And that was done by secret cables, which of course were intercepted. And one of the sad features is that, of course, these things were in code, and it wasn't until years later, actually after the war had finished, that these codes began to be broken. Had they been broken earlier, this message, which was not finally broken until 1968, would have been known to us. And it says, on the 8th of August, 1941, Bark, that is the code name for Colonel Kramer, the man who Fuchs had met at that party in April, had a meeting with former acquaintance, Dr. Fuchs. So former acquaintance is referring back to that April party. This is unique because, of course, Fuchs is mentioned by name here. Later on, as we will see, when Fuchs was spying in North America and the cables were intercepted and eventually decrypted, Fuchs was now only referred to by a code name, Rest or Charles, but it didn't tell you who Rest or Charles was. So this is unique, this thing. This actually mentions Fuchs by name. At the bottom of this, I've highlighted 1,000 tons of dynamite. So it is clear that by August, Fuchs is already passing information about the strength of this weapon. The 1,000 tons of dynamite is an allusion I mentioned earlier, which is in the Frisch and Peierls memorandum. Now, this information was referring to a meeting in August. The Russians don't take you on as a spy overnight. They obviously had to spend some time vetting for themselves and checking that this guy wasn't a plant and so on and so forth. So the decision to be working with them must have been taken sometime before August, and you're getting back to very near to June. So I think it's very likely that Fuchs took that decision the day of Churchill's broadcast. So Kramer was his go-between, if you like, initially. Now, quite quickly, Kramer was returned to the USSR, and the GRU, the Red Army network, lost contact with Fuchs. And for a whole year, he had no contact with the Russians. During this year, a lot of progress was being made, not least in Oxford on the experimental work on diffusion, and also on the theoretical work that he and Peierls in particular were driving forward. And by early 42, there was a breakthrough. For the first time, they began to realize there is a way forward here, that we could indeed make a weapon, and Fuchs desperately needed to get this information to the Russians. And he used some Communist Party contacts that he had from his days back at Edinburgh in Scotland to do that. And through all of this, he was put in contact with this woman here, who looks a bit like Harpo Marx, but is actually Ursula Buerten, or codename Sonya, that Ben McIntyre has written a biography about, sometimes known as the girl from Banbury. She lived variously in Kidlington, just north of Oxford, or in Shipping Norton up in the Cotswolds. And she and Fuchs would meet outside Banbury, coming by train from Oxford and Banbury respectively to meet. Now, the interesting thing is that from Russian KGB records, which have been translated by former defectors, if you like, we know some information about the meetings that Fuchs had during this period. he had 2 meetings with Kramer, the ones in 1941. Then he had 5 meetings with Ursula Buerten, and I've highlighted the one in July 1943, because one of the questions that's always been is, how did Fuchs manage to get, I mean, he's there living with the Peierls family. And if you knew the Peierlses, you knew what a close-knit group you are once you're in with the Peierlses. How did Fuchs manage to get away with some story to be able to go and meet his contacts in Banbury the weekend? Well, thanks to the Bodleian Library, where Peierls's papers are kept, I stumbled upon 2 things quite by accident, which gives an answer, at least on one occasion. And it's this. The one occasion is the information he sent on the 12th of July, 43. So these 2 letters, which have nothing to do with that at first sight, on the 6th of July, 43, Professor Hoon Rothery in the chemistry department here at Oxford had obviously been writing a book, and he wanted to have some of the equations checked. And Mott had suggested that Fuchs might be a person to do this. And so Hoon Rothery writes to Peierls asking if Fuchs would do this work. And 2 days later, Peierls replied. The great thing about Peierls was that in his papers, not only do you have the letters that he received, but you have carbon copies of the letters that he sent out. So you can see both sides of the, it's not like being on a train and hearing one side of a mobile phone conversation. You hear, or you can read both sides of it. So Peierls replies on the 8th of July, Fuchs is on holiday this week. So during Fuchs's holiday was obviously when he managed to make contact with Ursula Buerten, and the information then get passed on later. So that brings us then to 44, when the work has advanced so much that the Americans now are beginning to work in this area, or have been for some time, and it is clearly most efficient to combine everything, not least because Britain is still under threat, and it all working out in North America becomes the way forward, and the beginnings of what is called the Manhattan Project takes place. Fuchs and Peierls and a handful of other Brits move across to New York, where they carry on their work on the theory and practice of diffusion, designing what eventually became the diffusion facility at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which prepared the uranium-235 for the bomb that was exploded over Hiroshima. Now, this is the second time when Fuchs is vetted. And on this occasion, buried in the files at Kew is a remarkable letter. As you go through these files, you discover that some things have been held, or some things are still redacted 70 years later, but some remarkable things are still left there. This one is one of them. Major Garrett is a man in MI5, responsible for the vetting, and he's writing to Michael Perrin, who is the administrator in charge of the British part of the Manhattan Project. And this is a letter about Fuchs, because Perrin is wanting to know, has everybody in the British party been vetted properly? Garrett says about Fuchs, it would not appear to be desirable to mention his proclivities to the authorities of the United States. Proclivities here meaning communist history. And we do not think it at all likely he will attempt to make political contacts in that country while he is there. Well, how wrong can you be? But if the Americans had sight of this letter back then, I think the Brits would have been hung out to dry. That's an absolutely clear-cut keeping quiet about something. Fuchs's third phase of espionage is then the year later, they move to Los Alamos, where he discovers that the plutonium is the way forward for the bomb. And later, he starts work on the hydrogen bomb. And at the end of the war, when the Brits were being cut out of atomic know-how, Fuchs remained for a year at Los Alamos in order that he would have the best know-how when he returned to Britain, so that the Brits would be able to build and design their own weapons. So Fuchs, as we will see, ended up spying for everybody on everybody. I wanted to talk actually about the hydrogen bomb here, because there are some very interesting things that I discovered as a scientist about this. For a long time, I think we were all aware that after the war, in 1945, Enrico Fermi gave a lecture at Los Alamos about the possibility of making a hydrogen bomb and concluded that he couldn't see a way to do it. And this lecture has been shrouded in secrecy ever since. The key thing, let me just say for people, is the difference between an atomic and a hydrogen bomb. An atomic bomb, the one where you start with a heavy element like uranium and split it to release energy, you have to have what's called more than a critical mass. A small lump won't be explosive, but two small lumps brought together makes enough to be explosive. That means that there is an upper limit to the power of an atomic bomb, because however big you make the uranium lump to begin with, when it fragments in the explosion, you're left eventually with subcritical amounts. In practice, you cannot make an atomic bomb much more powerful than the ones actually which were exploded at the end of the Second World War. Hydrogen bombs, however, are quite different. You bring the light element, well, isotopes of the light element hydrogen together, like in the sun, that there is no theoretical limit, I mean, there's a practical limit, but you're only limited by how much fuel you can bring together. The key thing to make this fusion of the hydrogen bomb fuel happen, you need a very high temperature. And the basic idea was an atomic explosion creates a temperature of maybe 10 million degrees, and that could be the spark to ignite the hydrogen explosion. And that was the basic idea. So Fermi gives this lecture at Los Alamos, which, as I said, has remained shrouded in secrecy ever since. And here, for example, are 3 papers that you'll find listed in the National Archives. One is Miscellaneous Superbomb Notes, that is hydrogen bomb in our modern language, by Klaus Fuchs. Collected Notes on Fermi's Superbomb Lectures, plural, and more about Fermi's lectures. Now, don't waste your time going and look for these things, because they're still 70 years after the event classified. However, Fuchs was very generous, of course, with his information, and he passed this information to the Soviets, and the Soviets have published it themselves. Indeed, if you go and look around, you will find in this document on the left, the Superbomb Notes by Klaus Fuchs. If you go and look at Trinity College Library in Cambridge, where G.P. Thomson's papers are stored, you will find the sole surviving open copy of a summary of the notes by the lectures of Fermi that were made on behalf of the Brits. And thanks to Alex Wellerstein in the States and Freedom of Information in the USA, we now have the full transcript lectures of Fermi's lectures. And these are fascinating for many reasons, and I will just show you one of them. The date of the first lecture, there were 6 or 7 in all, was the 2nd of August 1945. Now put this in context. The Trinity test of the atomic plutonium bomb took place on the 16th of July. It has not yet been exploded over Japan. Already, Fermi is giving a lecture on the hydrogen bomb. Now, this tells us something about Fermi and exactly what I think is interesting to debate. I see here Fermi, the scientist, totally excited by the science and engineering of what has been going on. They have for years been theorizing about this. The Trinity test has proven that this is practically possible. And for the first time, it's hard to imagine, but you have seen the incredible power latent in an atomic nucleus released. For a scientist, that is something. The implications of this for humanity at this moment, I think, are not yet really understood. Fermi has seen, we have the spark for the hydrogen bomb, and he's giving this first lecture. He gives a series of lectures, and the titles of them are down the side. You don't need to read them at all. His 5th lecture was given on September the 17th. On September the 19th, we know from Russian records, Fuchs met his courier, a man called Harry Gold, in Santa Fe. That's 2 days after Fermi's 5th lecture. And I would suggest that on this occasion, Fuchs passed the information of Fermi's lectures so far to Harry Gold. There's been a lot of doubt about exactly when and if and what Fuchs passed about the hydrogen bomb. I think here we have as near as you'll ever get to a smoking gun. First of all, at a rather low level, like Mandy Rice Davis might have said, why wouldn't he? However, I think we can do better than that, because from Fermi's lectures and the Russian published versions, just compare these. The top is a diagram from Fermi's lectures, which you will see without knowing any details, looks remarkably similar to the thing from the Russian document down the bottom. For those of you who are numerate, the numbers of cross-sections that are in Fermi's lectures appear in the Russian version 1945 down the bottom. And the third thing, which I find most interesting, is that, of course, Fuchs met gold on the 19th of September. Fermi's final lecture does not take place until October the 9th, and there is nothing in that Russian document about Fermi's final lecture. So I think that's as near as you can ever get to showing that Fuchs indeed passed the first information about the hydrogen bomb as early as 1945. That said, the know-how at that stage, at the conclusion of Fermi's lectures, is he couldn't see any way to make the thing work. So that might have been good news, but as a piece of history, I find it interesting. So the war finishes, the Mcmahon Act comes into place. They cut all allies out of nuclear know-how, including the Brits. The Brits have to go it alone. Fuchs stays an extra year at Los Alamos. He even has a patent on a way of improving the ignition of a hydrogen bomb, which he writes with John von Neumann. Neumann, who is an extremely right-wing person, and Fuchs, who was extremely left-wing, two quite remarkable combination of intellects there. And then he comes back to Britain. Now, in Britain, a very secret decision was taken, which didn't even involve all members of the cabinet, that we were going to build an atomic bomb of our own. And the man leading this was Bill Penny. The project began down at Fort Halstead near Croydon in London. And it was so secret that the Prime Minister obviously knew, and only a handful of his colleagues. What was not known even in Harwell was that the lead theoretical scientist on this project was Klaus Fuchs. I think probably only maybe 3 people in Harwell were aware of this fact, because nobody even knew that we were doing this, let alone that Fuchs was secretly involved in it. So for 4 years, he was effectively the lead scientist on the British atomic bomb. And also discussions about whether it was possible to make a hydrogen bomb were also in there. And I found another document that shows that he passed information when he met his Russian colleague in London in 48. During this time, thanks to Fuchs, the British atomic bomb project was an open book in Moscow. In 1948, some miscellaneous notes by Fuchs in his handwriting down the left-hand side, and you can compare them with Russian documents that the Russians have published on the right-hand side. And this is information about deuterium cross-sections, many things that you need to know about hydrogen bombs as of 1948. So Fuchs was indeed passing information all along until 1949. And in 1949, in August, several things happened. First of all, the Russians exploded their own atomic weapon, and Fuchs stopped spying. Now, whether he stopped spying because he felt job was done, or whether he got a tip-off, we don't know. I suspect the latter, because this is where the interesting thing that led to Fuchs's demise comes about. There has been, I mean, everybody knows that Fuchs was eventually exposed because some Russian codes were decrypted. The received wisdom has been that it was the FBI, and in particular Robert Lamphere, who was very much involved in this at the National Security Agency in Washington. And J. Edgar Hoover, of course, milked this. Actually, as I'll show you, it was GCHQ what done it. The story starts intriguingly in 1942, when the Americans have entered the war, and Winston Churchill, I found this note also in the Bodleian Library. Winston Churchill wrote a letter to the President of the United States, basically saying, my people have been able to read your secret diplomatic cables. That's what the first thing here. The importance of our cipher people getting into close contact with yours. I should be very ready to put any expert you care to nominate in touch with my technicians. Some time ago, our experts claimed to have discovered the system and constructed some tables used by your diplomatic corps. Namely, we've been reading your secret messages. From the moment when we became allies, I gave instructions this work should cease. So basically, we can read your stuff, but I've told our guys not to do it anymore because we're working together. However, the possibility that enemies might have done what our people have been able to do means we should all get together and discuss it. And then the thing at the end, if possible, burn this letter when you have read it. Well, obviously you didn't, because we can read it today. That is how the collaboration between Britain and America in decryption, cryptography began. And that is actually what, if there is still any special relationship, or if after tomorrow or whenever it's settled, the special relationship gets restored, that's when it began. The National Security Agency were involved, GCHQ were involved, like two hands working together. In the 1960s and 70s, finally, these decryptions were released. There's about 3,500 of them you can access on the web, but you can't tell the sequence of the decryptions. You can only see the final version. What you can do, though, is work out which ones come from GCHQ and which ones from America. There are little giveaways. If you go and find anything with a black circle on the top right, that's a GCHQ one, not least because you'll notice the date is written in day, month, year. There are various British idioms that appear in those, whereas there's American idioms in the other style. I show you this because I'm now going to show you the key thing that revealed Fuchs's spying. That in June 1944, Fuchs had a meeting with Harry Gold, his courier, in New York. This was before moving to Los Alamos. This is why while he and Peierls and the Brits were still working, designing Oak Ridge. And he and Gold were very careful. They only met for a very brief moment, passed information, went their separate ways. Fuchs was so careful, he absolutely was certain that he had done nothing wrong. Gold passes information to a Russian contact. The Russian contact takes it back to the Russian embassy. Now the message has to be sent to Moscow. It's done by these cables. And that turns out to be the weak link of the whole thing. It's not until 1948 or 9 that GCHQ and the Americans start being able to decrypt these things. And finally, this particular one is decrypted. There are three key things in it. There's mention of a spy, codename Rest. The second red box says that they've received from Rest the third part of a report, blah, 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 diffusion method, work on his speciality. So from this, we know that the spy Rest is working on diffusion. So this quickly, through a little bit of elimination, focuses them onto Fuchs or Peierls. We're talking the end of 1949 now. It's only at this period that this information is becoming known to us. Is it Fuchs or Peierls? The bottom red box has some reference to Rest meeting the islands director. Island is the code word for Britain. Carthage is the code word for Washington. Basically, Fuchs had a meeting with Chadwick, the head of the British delegation in Washington, because at that time, there was a question about whether Fuchs would return to Britain or go to Los Alamos. And it was from this combination that very quickly it was focused on Fuchs. Now that story is to some degree well known. The impression has been given in books that it was all done by the FBI, and I can show you now that is not true. Thanks to a bit of guidance from somebody at GCHQ, I was told there are things openly accessible in the National Archives if you know where to look. Namely, reports on some progress in some messages, which thankfully happen to include this key message. Let's look at the thing on the right. This is the version after GCHQ had worked on it in 1949, which reveals the three key things: Rest, the spy; diffusion, his work; and the bottom that he will have to leave soon, which points it towards Fuchs. On the left is the state of the decryption art a year earlier, when the National Security Agency had been working on it. The green box is just so you can compare the thing on the left with the thing on the right. I've in yellow highlighted Enormos. Enormos was the Russian code word for the Manhattan Project. That much the decryptors already had known. So in 1948, there was this message which had enormos in it, which showed it was clearly a reference to something going on in the Manhattan Project. It was therefore important. That's as far as the Americans got with it. Passed it over to GCHQ, the bits in red got decrypted, and those are the things that led eventually to Fuchs. And that was due, due to GCHQ. So as of August, it was clear there was a spy in the British mission. Rest. Was it Peierls or Fuchs? Well, GCHQ says it's Fuchs. And this was sorted out by October. The British Embassy in Washington sent this message to London to say that they've confirmed that the spy arrest is Fuchs, and that the local MI6 representative in Washington is sending the gist of this to his HQ in London. The local MI6 representative was Kim Philby. So things begin to fall into place. Philby knows that Fuchs has been exposed. Philby's autobiography says he tried to warn Fuchs, but despite his best efforts, didn't manage to. But clearly something got through, because a few days after this, Fuchs went to visit the Harwell security officer, a man called Henry Arnold. Excuse me. Testing the waters, I think. Fuchs became confident that he was in the clear, that they didn't know much about him. So he stayed put. And MI5, they knew that Fuchs was their man, but the only information they had were these decrypted cables, which was so secret they couldn't use it. So they had to try and catch him in the act. The irony of ironies, Fuchs had already stopped spying. They watched him for 4 months, 24/7. They bugged his prefab apartment. This is what it was like at Harwell. It was a bit like a prison camp. His prefab was bugged. The only thing they found out was that he was having an affair with the head of the nuclear physics division. He was followed. Ernest Skinner was her name. They followed the car of Fuchs and Skinner. You can tell how closely they were followed. On the 20th of September, the report says that they stopped for an hour at the Bull Inn in Henley, drinking double gins before driving to Harwell. Those were the good old days when there weren't many people on the road. They even had the 17th of January, Fuchs and Erna went off on a 3-day tryst. The first night they stayed at Maidenhead, the Riviera Hotel, and 2 nights in Richmond-on-Thames in London. And it seems that during this time, Fuchs, who was now getting very stressed, I think without doubt, he knew that MI5 were following him. He'd been tipped off at some level, and I think you just couldn't miss the cars. In those days, there wasn't much traffic around. A guy following you around becomes rather obvious. And at some level, he confessed to Ernest Skinner that he had done something untoward, but not very significant, maybe. We don't know, unfortunately, the details of that. We do know that by the 23rd of January, Fuchs was eventually arrested at the 1st or 2nd of February. The 23rd of January, he had lunch with the Harwell security officer at the Steventon House Hotel. That's a few miles south of Oxford. Arnold did a very clever thing. A general election had just been called. And so Arnold used that as an excuse to start talking politics with Fuchs. And in the course of this, got the impression that Fuchs was rather more left-wing than anybody had really appreciated before. In fact, seemed to be very sympathetic to communism, a fact which had never been admitted to them. Also, he had the impression that Fuchs wanted to get something off his chest. So having had lunch with Henry Arnold, the Harwell officer of security, on the 23rd, the next day, up from London comes MI5 interrogator Jim Scarden, who takes Fuchs to lunch at Abingdon's grandest hotel, which you no longer will find. Unfortunately, it's now been sort of demolished and converted into some horrendous bits of architecture, but the Queen's Hotel on the marketplace. And during this meal, Fuchs eventually made it clear to Scarden that he wanted to get back to his apartment and get it off his chest, basically. So Fuchs has had 2 meals at taxpayers' expense on 2 successive days. It's never clear in the records who paid for them, but there we are. And Fuchs then confessed when he got back to his apartment, or prefab. Here it was Scarden who wrote down the confession, and then you can see at the top Fuchs writing confirmation that that is indeed what he said. However, we only have Scarden's word for it, because this took place in Fuchs's prefab, which has been bugged so well that it's revealed intimate details of his affair with Ernest Skinner, and you can read about those in my book if you want, not now. And yet, on the day of his confession, there is no record whatsoever. Anyway, that's another mystery. The result of this is Fuchs was arrested. He was sentenced to 14 years in jail. That was the maximum sentence that could be given because he had passed information in wartime to an ally, not to an enemy. He hadn't committed high treason. However, this, of course, led to decimation of the networks in the States. His courier, Harry Gold, was arrested. This led eventually to the arrest of the Rosenbergs, who ended up in the electric chair. The KGB, not surprisingly, were not pleased. Anyway, Fuchs was in jail. 1959, he was released on good behavior and went to live in East Germany. And I thought that was the end of the story, but not quite, because I then discovered what happened next. That, would you believe it, the KGB records show that they wanted Fuchs to be their agent in East Germany. Fuchs managed to get out of that. They also wanted to know why it was that he had failed, why he had confessed and given everything away. I also discovered, well, he got married to an East German Politburo woman, and he was deputy director of the Dresden Nuclear Physics Lab until his death in 1988. I also discovered something very tragic, which is this. In the Peierls papers, there's a carbon of a letter that Rudy wrote when he heard that Klaus Fuchs was coming out of jail. Dear Klaus, I see from the papers you're soon going to be released. If you need any help in getting started in life, financial or otherwise, or if you need any advice, please let me know. I shall do what I can. And Fuchs never replied. Now, I've checked the prison records. Peierls' letter certainly arrived. Whether Fuchs did not get it for some reason, or whether Fuchs was just so ashamed that he couldn't reply, we don't know. Fuchs, for the rest of his life, he had contact with Nick Curti, another Oxford physicist that he worked with. He even maintained contact with Henry Arnold, the Harwell security officer who'd been party eventually to Fuchs's confession and conviction. Yet he was not able to have contact with the Peierls for the rest of his life. And I think that that's the nearest we get ever to really understanding how Fuchs reacted to all of this. I think that Fuchs realized there was a remarkable letter that Jenny Peierls wrote to him in jail, and I've copied that out in the book, which is one of the great letters of the 20th century, which I think got through to him so much that it cracked. And he realized that it's one thing to betray ideals, it's another thing to betray your friends. And I think that this failure to communicate with the Peierls was the nearest we get to realizing that he suffered shame. So that is how it is. We will end with the faces of Klaus Fuchs. As a student in 1933, his Los Alamos security card in 1945, on the plane in 1959, flying back to freedom or whatever it was, and in 1979, a photograph of him as a scientist in East Germany. The thing that intrigues me is this, that we only know that Fuchs was a spy because he confessed. If he had not confessed, nobody would ever have known. There was a spy at Los Alamos called Ted Hall, a young American, who denied everything. And it was only in 1999, through other routes, that it became known that he'd done this. So if Fuchs had kept quiet, what might the story then have been? Well, we'd have the picture of him as the student the same. By 1945, he would be the hero of the atomic bomb. It was he, in particular, that worked out how to implode plutonium effectively. He would have been a fellow of the Royal Society. Indeed, he had been nominated as an FRS at the time of his arrest. And there is an intriguing letter where Peierls withdraws the nomination after he's appeared in jail, not for scientific reasons, but that the quality of the person might be questionable. And in 1979, he would have been a retired English scientific hero, the father of the British hydrogen bomb as well, perhaps. So I'll come to the end by imagining that scenario. Rudolf Peierls became Sir Rudolf Peierls for his great efforts and starting the whole project and bringing it to fruition in 1945. Bill Penny, who became the director of the whole British atomic and later hydrogen bomb projects, became Baron Penny of East Hendred. Fuchs's deputy, Brian Flowers, who succeeded him at Harwell, eventually became Lord Flowers of Queensgate. Would Klaus Fuchs have received any less honours than these? He would have been the father of the British atomic bomb and of the hydrogen bomb, head of Harwell. It would have been a different world entirely. I'm sure he would have ended up Lord Fuchs of Harwell, the Red Baron. Well, that's the story. If you want to know more about it, it's all in there. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for a truly marvelous talk. Now, unfortunately, we can't unmute everybody and give you all a round of applause, but I should do that for everybody. That was absolutely terrific. So now we're going to take questions. The questions can be typed into the question and answer window that all of you have access to. I will be reading questions to Frank, and then Frank will answer them. And so the first question is from Terry Hayward, and he says, Eugenia Peierls was Russian. She met Rudolf in Odessa, and they were later married in Leningrad. Was there ever suspicion that she might have initiated, encouraged, or facilitated Fuchs' espionage?
There was certainly suspicion. I hope that I'm also audible still. There was certainly suspicion, and indeed, the MI5 files show this fact. And after much investigation and so on, years later, they finally cleared this and admitted that the only thing about her that raised suspicion was that she had a Russian background. There are conspiracy theorists even today who will claim that indeed she was, but there was never any evidence. And I will quote Rudy's successor on this, Roger Elliott, who anybody who knew Genia Peierls will have the meaning of this. He said, well, she could well have been an agent, but she could never have been a secret agent.
Thank you for that answer. The second question is from Liam, and it says, it appears that Fuchs' contributions to US and UK atomic projects were significant. Is it possible to claim Trinity tests might not have happened without his input, in which case he is instrumental to 3 atomic projects?
I think it is fair to say he was indeed instrumental in 3 atomic projects. It is also clear that his input was exceedingly important in the success of the Trinity test. Whether somebody else would have been able to do it had he not there, I'm sure that would have been the case. But what is interesting is the reason why Fuchs, there was a point in the talk where I said in that critical cable, the thing that identified it was Fuchs and not Peierls was the fact that in 1944, the plans were for Fuchs to return to Britain. Peierls at that moment happened to be visiting Los Alamos, and it was while Peierls was there, he discovered 2 things. One, that the plutonium weapon on plutonium implosion was the new project. Secondly, there were great theoretical problems to solve, and that the equations to solve were similar in structure to ones that he and Fuchs had been solving in a different context back in their days in Birmingham. And for that reason, he wanted Fuchs desperately to join the team in Los Alamos and work with him. So that is how Fuchs went to Los Alamos, and without doubt, the post-war, the Smythe report, I think it was, said that Fuchs and Peierls were 2/3 of the essential team that developed the plutonium implosion. Yes, I think with regards even to the hydrogen bomb as well, there is an esteemed historian who said that Fuchs was certainly the grandfather of the hydrogen bomb in America, Britain, and the Soviet Union.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is from our well-known colleague, Chris Llewellyn-Smith. And he's asked, is it true that after Fuchs confessed, Skardon asked him to provide details of the information he had given to the Russians, and Fuchs refused on the grounds that Skardon's security clearance was not high enough?
This is a good story. It could well be true. There is nothing that I found in the Q files to back it up, which is a shame. Whether Scarden had it removed or not, I've no idea. But knowing Fuchs's style, I mean, he was a very careful person. And although we don't have a direct evidence that he said that or didn't say that in the case of Scarden, it is the case that he, I believe, would not say something to Henry Arnold at Harwell because of security concerns. He was a complex person. He had at one level a very clear divide between what you can do and what you can't do, while at the same time he seemed to be quite happy to cross it in another dimension.
Yes, fascinating. And this question will touch upon this as well in a different way. So Stephen Phelps asks, given that Frisch and Peierls and many others involved in developing the bomb thought that global security could only be assured if many countries, rather than just the United States, had the bomb, do you think he was perhaps driven by a conviction that he could secure international peace by ensuring the Russians had it?
Yes, I think that is indeed the case. It fits in certainly with his character. He did say as much. I'm not sure whether it was to the FBI interrogation here in the FBI sent some people across to interrogate him along with MI5. Then later, post 1959, when he was back in East Germany, he was invited to go and give a talk at Dubna, and the two scientists who accompanied him turned out to be KGB people. He caught onto that, and to them he gave a rather different story. So it is certainly on record that Fuchs himself said that he wanted to share this for mankind. But as I said, he often had a habit of telling people what they wanted to hear. That said, I think it is certainly consistent with everything we know about him. And I'll just say a comment that Tam Diel, the late Member of Parliament and one-time Father of the House of Commons, said to me in this. He said, I knew the atomic scientists well. So he transmitted to me something that Chadwick had said to him. I knew the atomic scientists well. I do not condone what the spies did, but you and your generation may be thankful that they did it. Indeed, it's the case that had Fuchs not passed the information, the Russian bomb that they exploded in 1949 would have probably been delayed by 18 months or so, which might not sound very much now, but when you realize that the Korean War was taking place in 1950 and there were hawks in America who wanted to use atomic weapons in Southeast Asia, it was very delicately balanced as to what might have happened but for Klaus Fuchs. So it's true that he seemed to share information with everybody, which is totally consistent with the implicit nature in your question, that he was trying to help humanity.
Thank you. Now the next question is from James Graham, and he asked, did nobody at Los Alamos twig Fuchs was a leftist? A bit of a contrast to David Bohm's somewhat ignoble fate.
Well, certainly contrasted to Bohm, yes. The twig he was a leftist, we have to remember it was a different time then than it is now. Almost everybody was, in a modern way of looking at it, a leftist. The scientists, we know these people today, we overlook the fact that they were in their 20s at that stage. They had grown up in the 1930s. From Europe, they consisted to a large degree of, in particular, Jewish emigres from Nazism, people who, like Fuchs, were anti-fascist, and in America, people who had grown up during the Great Depression. And so this was a generation for whom socialism was, I mean, are you a socialist or are you a fascist? That was really the question that had to be decided. And in that sense, they all were, quote, well, not all, but, you know, there was a substantial number of. And indeed, if you ever read General Groves' memoirs, one of the challenges he had was to decide, are they serious leftists or okay in that sense? So I think the answer is yes, they did, but so what? at that stage, given everybody else.
Yes, thank you. Now, the next couple of questions are in a rather different aspect of the talk, really. So the first of them is from an anonymous attendee today, and he asks, or she asks, what got you interested in this topic in the first place?
I wrote a book called Half-Life, which was the story of Bruno Ponte-Corvo. Half-Life because he was a great physicist, who we all know of working in neutrinos and so on. Had he survived long enough, would probably have shared in the Nobel Prize, certainly the one that Ray Davis got for solar neutrinos, and also was involved in neutrino oscillations. But halfway through his life, he disappeared to the Iron Curtain in 1950 and spent the second half of his life at Dubna. And he had worked at Harwell at the same time as Klaus Fuchs. And one of the big questions in the archives, and at that time, was Fuchs was arrested in February and convicted of spying. Ponte-Corvo does a runner in August, and you can imagine everybody panicking. And so I researched Ponte-Corvo's story, and in the course of doing that, I talked to Lorna Arnold, who was a historian of the British Atomic Bomb Project. She was then 97 years old, and she had known some of these people. And in the course of talking to her, I said, I found these, some of the Klaus Fuchs files in the archives, and she knew Fuchs, and she said to me, going back to an earlier question, she said, Fuchs, she believes, has been misunderstood. The existing literature on him has him as a terribly bad man. I knew him as a man of great conscience. And I think, he'd be interesting. And so it was that actually that got me started on Klaus Fuchs. And just to complete the circle here, I mentioned the way that Fuchs approached Henry Arnold, the security officer, after Philby's involvement. And I didn't know that when I researched Ponte-Corvo. And if any of you read Half-Life, you will see there's an uncanny similarity with the way that a few months later, Ponte-Corvo approaches the same Henry Arnold with a very similar testing the waters story. And we know that Philby was involved on that occasion because we have a letter that I found that Philby had been involved in sending from the British Embassy in Washington about Ponte-Corvo. So that's the nearest I've got to asking myself now bigger questions about Ponte-Corvo's involvement in espionage than I previously had, but that's another story.
That was a fascinating answer, thank you. So the next question is from Joseph Dudek. And he says, hi Frank, as someone doing physics confined to my house in Newport News, Virginia, I wonder, did Fuchs do physics while he was in prison? Did they restrict what he could work on or read about?
Yeah, of course he didn't have the internet in those days to do it from wherever. But yes, he did. He had some physics textbooks sent. It's very interesting and amusing, as a physicist, seeing MI5 checking through all these things, trying to have somebody make sense that there's not secret messages encoded in all these algebraic formulae. But yes, he did. But nothing of any significance. He was consulted by Bill Penny in 1952 about the hydrogen bomb. That I know because the Brits decided that they were going to do a hydrogen bomb. At that stage, nobody knew really what there was a physical difference between hydrogen and atomic bomb. Bill Penny, who was not a nuclear physicist, he was a regular explosives man. The only person he had with any know-how was Klaus Fuchs. And Penny made a visit to Fuchs in prison and consulted him on this. I don't know whether Fuchs did any calculations of his own. That would be a fascinating story to write as a fiction story, if not for real. But the short answer, Joe, is yes, he did. Nothing of any significance, however. By the time he left jail in '59, nuclear physics had moved on. The idea that Fuchs had any knowledge in his head that he could take and share with East Germany by then, that was long gone.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Chris Jones, who says, did I understand from your book that at the time of his prosecution, even his prosecutors were not aware that he was the lead scientist in the British H-bomb project and that he did not reveal this fact in his defense?
Yeah, it's the British Atomic Bomb Project, yeah.
Yes, that's right, yeah, that's what I've read.
That's totally true. This is one of the strangest things, that the and this touches back on probably on the question that Chris Smith asked about Fuchs not mentioning to Scarden because of his security clearance. Fuchs did not tell anybody that he had this critical role in the top secret British atomic bomb project. First of all, nobody, his prosecutors didn't know of this. MI5 didn't know of this. Even his colleagues at Harwell, by and large, didn't know of this at that time. It was totally and utterly secret that Fuchs was working on it. Fuchs actually used the secrecy of this to cover his tracks when he went up to London to see his Russian contacts. I found through his travel records that on 3 occasions he went to a meeting in Cambridge, and on 1 occasion in his car, the total distance was about 40 miles further than it had been on the other occasions, and that happened to be the same weekend the records show that he met his contacts at a pub in London. So you can put all these things together. But Fuchs didn't make any attempt to defend himself at all. One of the great mysteries, it was almost as if he had done it, he wanted it dealt with. Yes, the great irony to me is that from the British point of view, the Russians must have been laughing because they had got everything they needed at that time from Fuchs. He got them started on their hydrogen bomb program. He'd helped them develop their atomic bomb program. And now the Brits have gone and shot their star centre forward in the knee.
Yes, irony. Now, the next 3 questions have already been answered already in your previous answers, so I'm going to skip those because it would be too repetitive for the audience. But instead, there's another question that's just come in from Patrick. And so Patrick asks, did you get to interview Rudolf Peierls about this? Now, of course, you weren't writing the book at the time that you would have met Rudolf Peierls, but Patrick recognizes that. He goes on to say, I remember him shuffling around Oxford nuclear physics in the early 1990s during my DPhil, not many years after reading The Cosmic Onion. So maybe you could answer that more by talking about your own experiences and knowledge of meeting and talking to Peierls.
Yeah, among many great sadnesses is, if only I had known 30 odd years ago, or 40 years ago, or I regret years ago, that I was going to be so interested in this today, I'd have had many more conversations with Rudy about this. But I will make a link with this, going back to something that an earlier questioner asked, how did I get interested in this? Question, how did I get interested in Ponte Corvo in the first place? I had been talking to Rudy after one of the Christmas parties. And I had been reading Laura Fermi's book, Atoms in the Family, which is her biography of Enrico Fermi. This was written in 1952. After Ponte Corvo had gone through the Iron Curtain, but for 5 years, nobody knew where he was. I should have said that Ponte Corvo was effectively a student of Enrico Fermi. So at the end of her book, she says, Ponte Corvo has disappeared off the face of the earth. Nobody knows what's happened to him, etc., etc., etc. By total chance, shortly after that, I read a copy of Physics Letters in which there was a paper by B.M. Ponte Corvo, Dubna, Russia. And I thought, does anybody know? And of course, the answer was yes, of course they knew. It was just that there hadn't been a new edition of Laura Fermi's book published in the 30 years since she'd written it. But then I was talking to Rudy at one of the Christmas parties, and I said, you know, was Ponte Corvo a spy, blah, 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 you know, how can you? And he paused and then with sort of sadness said, you never can tell. And that was, you know, that had an impact on me at that time. You know, but I did talk with him about these things. However, having said that, in the early 70s, we were totally unaware. I mean, Chris Smith may be able to, if he's still there, can type in whether he remembers different, but we were not aware that Peierls had written this top secret memorandum about the atomic bomb. That was still secret. We knew that he had been involved in the project, but what he had done in the project and his singular contribution to it, nobody knew that then. That was quite late on that all came out.
That's really fascinating. So the next question is from Martin Lamming, who starts with the word fascinating, referring to the talk you've just given us. He goes on to say, I understand that the name Trinity for the test came from the John Donne sonnet, Batter My Heart. Oppenheimer's favorite, from notes on John Adams' opera, Dr. Atomic. I work at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., where Herbert Friedman, the founder of the Space Science Division, where I now work, identified the Soviet 1949 test as a copy of the Nagasaki plutonium bomb from the radioactive isotopes collected in rainwater. Would you like to comment on that?
That's interesting. I hopefully will get a copy of this so I don't forget it. But Martin, if you can send an email to frank.close at the physics here with that, because that's interesting to know. Just a thing that about the identifying the nature of the atomic tests from the radioactive isotopes. The one cut after the whole breakdown post-war, 1946, where Britain was cut out of know-how by the States, the place where Britain had great strength was actually centered in Harwell, was the ability to analyze fallout and deduce the nature of weaponry and so on. So as of 1950, just before the whole Fuchs business comes out, by the way, great progress was being made at a high level to re-establish contacts between North America and the UK. Our trump card, if that's the right metaphor today, was to use give our know-how in ability to analyze fallout and so forth. And then, of course, the Fuchs affair happened and the whole thing just went belly up. So at a political level, there was huge political fallout as well as literal and metaphorical fallout in that. But yes, that's an interesting piece of history, and I hope I get a note to remind myself to pursue that. Thank you.
That's a great answer too. Thank you for that, Frank. And the next one comes from Pascal Kallenberg. He says, regarding who is considered father of the atomic bomb, there is also Leo Szilard mentioned regularly. What's the reason behind different attributions?
Well, okay, I suppose whoever you want to call father is to some degree up to you. I mean, people say that Oppenheimer was father of the atomic bomb. The reason I identified Peierls' father was twofold. One, he certainly has a legitimate claim, as I said, because but for his insight that you could only need this much of uranium-235 to do it, which indeed was the start of the project in the West, and also the fact that that enabled me to use the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost analogy for Trinity. Szilard, of course, was the person who had the insight that if you could have a chain reaction, the possibility of generating energy might be there, which certainly was interesting. That was 1932-3, not long after the neutron had been discovered. But that's 1932-3. I mean, the bomb, the idea that you could make a bomb doesn't happen for another 8 years. So I think to claim that he somehow started it from that is not really on. It's also true that Szilard, come 1939, rightly got very agitated at how discoveries about fission and I think even the theoretical possibilities of plutonium, I'm not sure on this, were being published in the open literature. And it was through Szilard, first of all, getting Einstein to send this letter to the president in the US to make him aware of the seriousness of all this. So Szilard played a very important role in facilitating people becoming aware that this was a big issue. But directly, the line between him and the atomic bomb at a scientific level, I think is pretty diffuse. As for Oppenheimer, Oppenheimer, of course, was the scientist in charge of the Los Alamos constructing project of the bomb itself. But that project would not have existed had the Brits in particular not started this whole thing off through Peierls and Frisch.
Thank you. That's a great answer. Now, a question from Charles Spencer. It's really a request more than a question. She says, please tell us some more about Philby's part in this story.
Well, the short answer to that is, this is not just a book plug. If you go and read Half-Life, you will certainly see the detail Philby's role in the Ponte Corvo story and the scoop that I had in finding the evidence for that. And then with that you can see his role in the present story, where the dates of him arriving in the British Embassy in Washington, these coincidences of fate, just at the right time, when the Brits were beginning to be involved with the top secret decoding project that Churchill had arranged with President Roosevelt back in '42 was making progress at last. And Philby arrived in the British Embassy in Washington just around the time that this progress was being recognized, and the FBI were getting involved because the decoders had the insight. We're beginning to get hints about possible spies here, but we don't know the first thing about them. Are there things in FBI records that you might be able to match up from the other end to help us make things forward? Philby arrived at that very moment. Philby was one of a literal handful of people who knew about, it was called the Venona Project. It was perhaps one of the most top secret projects of the war, and certainly the near post-war, and Philby was right in there. Less than have a half an hour, I think it's better for me to stop there and say, go read about it, and maybe I'll have a different talk another day.
Right. I think we're just going to have time for a couple more questions before we have to close. Caroline Gregory asks, you mentioned the terrible suicides in Fuchs' family. Have you concluded that these were significant in Fuchs' actions?
Yes, I think they were. What I didn't tell you was that he had another sister. This sister had migrated to Boston in the States. And when Fuchs moved from New York to Los Alamos, he lost contact with Harry Gold, his courier. But there was a fallback. We now know, found this in the MI5 records and crossed with the KGB records, that Fuchs's sister in Boston had a code name in Russia. She was called Ant, that she was an effective go-between in emergency. So Fuchs's sister had been used, and when Fuchs finally was, put under pressure by Skardon, Fuchs could not understand what was going on because he knew he had done nothing wrong. And I think Fuchs suspected, wrongly as it turns out, that his courier, Harry Gold, had been arrested in the States by the FBI, and that his sister had become involved, and that she was in danger of going to the electric chair, and so that Fuchs confessed in order to protect his sister, because he was worried. She was, I should have added, she was at that stage herself in a psychiatric hospital in Massachusetts, and I think that he was worried that she was probably going to kill herself, and he confessed to save her.
Two more questions and then we will end. The first is from Martin Barreau. He says, could you discuss the contributions of Lindemann to the bomb, if any, rather than his wartime advice to Churchill?
Probably short answer is no. Not because I don't want to. It's because it's something that's not right on the front of my head. I could recommend, there is a book by Adrian Fort, F-O-R-T, called Prof, which is the biography of Lindemann. It was written 10 years or so ago, but that is very good. It tells you a lot about Lindemann, about him as a scientist, and the opinions people did or didn't have about him as a scientist. Also a book by Graham Farmelow called Churchill's Bomb, which is perhaps the most modern thing, which will show you Lindemann's role and involvement.
Thank you. And so the final question comes from Chris Clement Smith. And Chris, of course, our dear colleague, he says, Rudy used to say that the only serious mistake in the memorandum was that it said that making the bomb would be very expensive, perhaps as expensive as building a battleship. Would you like to comment on that?
That's actually very interesting. I think there is technically another mistake, which was not necessarily an error mistake, but because of things that were not yet known, that they underestimated the actual size of what you would need by maybe an order of magnitude. So that may be why he made that particular analogy, but it makes you think, if they had realized the real amount of cost and effort that would have been involved, possibly the project would never have got started.
That's a great answer. So I'd like to now say first to the audience that if you look in the chat window, you'll see that we've been recording this event, and it will be available in the coming days on the department's YouTube channel. So the link is in the chat window. If you subscribe, you will not miss any future videos either. There's a lot of Q&A comments coming in now, thanking you, Frank, for a terrific talk. Many years ago, I was one of the people that was truly inspired by your book, The Cosmic Onion. And so it's especially enjoyable for me now to listen to you talk today and to thank you on behalf of almost 300 people that have been in the audience today listening to this incredible story that you've told so remarkably well. Thank you very much from all of us.
Thank you very much. And read all about it in Trinity, the book.
Absolutely, if you can find a bookstore open, but you can always get it online if you can't. So thank you everybody for coming today. We'll see you all very soon. Bye-bye.